weren't considered traditional Republican voters?
Sure. Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it's really a question the DNC is asking themselves right now, too, which is the Democratic Party in the United States as we get ready for 2018 and 2020. I think there are two pieces of this. One is obviously directly related to the president, which is he had a message that was unlike any message that we've really seen in American politics on a national scale in a long time, and it clearly resonated with voters. And so you saw a level of energy come from the electorate that we hadn't seen, I would argue, in decades. Number one. Number two, if I were to brag on the Republican National Committee, I would say there's a lot of time spent registering voters and talking to voters leading up to an election that can't be done in the last 90, 120 days. And so you spend a lot of time really using data to mine the electorate and mine the U.S. population for people that we believe will vote on Election Day if the right message is sent. And so you had really what I believe was kind of the perfect storm, which was you had a national party committee that spent years registering and identifying voters, and then you melded it with a candidate that had the right message at the right time, and I think that led to the president's victory. So
what you're saying is that it's actually the on the ground still matters a lot, and the social media is used to help push the message.
I think no matter what the message is, you need to know who you're talking to, right? And you need to know who you're targeting. One of the things I always talk about at the Republican National Committee is you need to build a pathway to victory. And by doing that, you need to know what voters you want to have turn out on Election Day. And so Brad and I worked every day between, I would say, August and November, looking at the electorate, looking at people that we had registered to vote, and saying what message did the president have that's going to resonate with that voter? Do you send them an email? Do you send someone to their door? Do you, try and send them a YouTube ad through email? What do you do to connect with that voter? But you have to know what voters you're trying to talk to, and then match the message to that voter.
So, Mark, you worked with both Clintons, actually, as a pollster for them. Does social media actually move the dial on real votes? Can
well, of course, social media is an increasing factor, I think, in elections. I think, number one, what you find is that overnight, everybody knows everything. How is that possible? Not everybody was watching, that broadcast on CNN. Maybe 200,000 people were. But so there's an instantaneous, complete information flow so that by next day, every college kid knows everything. Every senior knows everything. So I think you get 100% information. Second, I think really that we've seen elections now have one of two strategies. Go for swing voters or bring out more of the base. When resources are limited, messages go, I think, necessarily to the swing voters. Bring them over. If it's the election's 5-5, if you just get one to switch, it's 6-4. Well, we have about 90 million, what I call couch potato voters in America, people who are eligible to vote but don't. And social media now, and these campaigns, now go more for trying to bring the fringe voters in. And even though you need 2 fringe voters to equal 1 swing voter who changes, most of the elections have used social media, I think now, to bring voters who would normally stay home into the process.
Now, Nigel, I would like to note your socks are a wonderful homage to your country.
It's a Brexit celebration, absolutely.
So, about Brexit, could there have been a Brexit without social media?
No, absolutely not. No way at all. Why did Brexit happen? It happened because an insurgent party, UKIP, started to get so big, it terrified the Prime Minister into promising a referendum. That's why we got it. UKIP would never have become a major party in British politics without the growth of YouTube from about circa 2008. I was going to Strasbourg every single month to the European Parliament, doing my stuff, saying what I thought about the European commissioners and everything else, and the BBC and others weren't interested. Once YouTube existed, suddenly that stuff started to reach very big audiences. So no, we are where we are because of social media.
Rosario?
That's so interesting, though, because a lot of young people were against the vote and were at Glastonbury that weekend, which I've been to, so I can understand the draw. But they were all very regretful that they weren't able to vote because had they actually thought it was going to go, they would have voted in they would have shown up and voted at all. But when you talk about the social media stuff, one I think is one of the reasons why people were so excited about this potential vote is because they were promised things like that money was going to go to the NHS. You had buses, adverts, and everything going on that were saying that that's where that money was going to go. So they were told things that immediately after the vote were taken away. And you were one of the people who said
nothing has been taken.
That you thought that you would never have promised that to begin with. And I think that's one of the reasons why the vote went that way that it
Well,
did. is 'cause
frankly,
people really...
whether you promised 200 million a week or 350 million a week is a pretty moot point. The point about young voters, though, is very interesting. So by about 2/3 to a third, young Britons who voted to stay in the European Union. But every other insurgent movement across the whole of the rest of Europe is the under 40s. So you've got the hard right vote, which would be, for example, the Freedom Party in Austria took the biggest number of votes from young people. Marine Le Pen took the biggest number of votes from young people. And on the left, you've got Syriza in Greece taking young votes. So there's something funny going on. The youth right across Europe are rebelling against European Union, against supranational government. Britain's in a different position for reasons I can't quite work out.
Well, definitely across, I think, the world, there's a real big pushback against the establishment. That's definitely happening, and young people are wanting change.
And the way that they talk to each other and talk to their leaders about it is on social media because, Nigel, as you have said before, they're not watching television. They're not going to the BBC or ABC or even sometimes CNN, although we have a great presence online. Brad, 60 Minutes called you the secret weapon of the Trump campaign. You were the digital director. You really used an intense micro-targeting online to reach voters. You said that you spent somewhere from 70 to 80% of your budget on Facebook alone. Why Facebook? And then second question after that, now there's a push to get them to be more regulated. Some officials both in the United States and Europe are saying, bringing them in for questioning, saying you need to do more to prevent misinformation, to prevent foreign governments meddling. So can you talk to those 2 points?
Yeah, so obviously we need to define a lot of eyeballs. Eyeballs are finite. There's only so many Americans that vote. There are only so many places. As we know, as we look at the demographics in America, TV watching is down, especially in the different areas that we needed to grab and the people we need to grab. And as we started to build our universes and we started to see who we were going to target, we had to find everyday Americans. We need to find people in new ways. We need to target people that would Trump's message would resonate with. And as we looked at that, and as I really understood very early was Facebook is where those people were. You had grandparents now looking at their kids, their grandkids online. You had people, looking and talking to old high school buddies. And next thing you know, you got a couple 100 million Americans on Facebook. And the cost per CPM, the cost, for your KPI there is just so low comparably, especially with a message like Trump that resonated across America. I was able to get to millions more people for a fraction of the money. And Hillary's team had, $400 or $500 million more than us. And so using Facebook was probably the best method that we could come up with to move past that disadvantage and end up being a right choice. Now, with the regulation stuff with Facebook, unfortunately I had to testify in front of Congress and all this stuff.
For 5.5 hours.
Yeah, it's fun. I think that Facebook, Twitter, all these companies have a certain amount of obligation to protect their platforms, and I've said publicly that I don't think any foreign country should meddle in our election. I don't believe that's good for America. I'm strongly behind that. I also think that if you believe in free speech, you believe in a free meddle, there's only so much regulation that can be done. You also don't want people being restricted in their communication. I think they have to look at that, and I think that keeping the money out is probably an easier thing to do. But I'm not for over-regulation. But I do think that they should be given an opportunity to probably maybe do some self-regulation and see what can happen. But I'm not in government, and I just help people get there.
I was going to ask you, you work a lot with young people. You're a co-founder of Vote a Latino that obviously does a lot of outreach to young Latinos. Do you think there's a responsibility for social media considering that young people use it so much?
Absolutely. And that is going to be a question that is going to have to be looked at for many years to come as we have, Sophia the robot getting citizenship and we're still calling human beings illegal. But I think what's fascinating is sort of looking at how this has kind of happened, sort of not just looking at it within, as you were saying, this particular vote, but the conversation has been built over many, many, many years with Trump, questioning the legitimacy of Obama's presidency over many years, kind of feeding into that anti-immigrant kind of conversation and creating what, as much as there's a hashtag not my president right now against Trump, that has been built and fostered for, 8, 9 years against Obama and really kind of like answering, which is the gap that Obama really left, which you can see Trump filling in really well. I was criticized during the primaries because I was saying Obama didn't really use social media that well at the beginning of his presidency. And yes, Twitter's only hitting its 10 years, but you could see it immediately. He had this huge groundswell of support. Now, believe, unlike with Bernie, where it actually came from $27, like this was an actual grassroots presidency and people really participating and spending money of their own. This wasn't money that was sort of generated like on the Hillary side that was going into things like Correct the Record, where people being targeted and their sites taken down, and people being manipulated for being corrected online. It wasn't that. It was he had an opportunity with $1 billion to have people who were paid, yes, to kind of go in and into these different communities, but people really did show up. He promised change, and within 2 years he lost the House, because he didn't keep that contact and keep that conversation going, which you can see Trump is doing incredibly well, which is just vitally important. It makes the people feel like it's the people's president, that there's access to him, that he's not closing the door and going, I'll just take it from here, but that you're actually invited into the White House, which was something that Obama promised but didn't deliver. At the very end of his presidency, he started to show that more, so now he's being called the social media president. But what you saw was with Bernie Sanders was that he really was that social media candidate, where he didn't have a lot of money. He started at 3% in the polls. This is the generation that grew up on The Daily Show and were like, roll the tape. And they would roll the tape. Trump would say something, they go, you said something completely different, roll the tape. Hillary, you're promising this thing, but roll the tape. But with Bernie, people went back and watched this man talking to an empty room against the Iraq War before it was popular to be talking against the Iraq War, and they felt like they had chosen someone. And so to see how Facebook being usurped with ads from Russia, or Twitter actually shutting down 48% of hashtags of the DNC leaks, and this participation actually these social media areas actually trying to regulate and shut down and really interfering in the election. This were people who were actually using social media to get through that and communicate with each other and choose someone that everyone was absolutely against. So now people are recognizing it and realize maybe that was not the right thing to do, and they're all coming forward now, but it's a little bit too late.
And also, we got to be accurate, though. Trump did get the most small dollar donors in history. So there was definitely a grassroots movement. I believe actually more than Hillary and small donors than Hillary and Obama combined. So,
For sure. She had a lot more she was doing 100,000 plus plate dinners, raising funds, and we saw all of the tremendous issues that were going on with there. Yeah, he didn't, and he also didn't raise nearly the amount of money, and did a lot better with actually funneling that money into the areas where it actually meant something, because this was the first meme election. This was about people just reaching out to each other in funny ways. Like, this is a person who understood they wanted someone to go in to D.C. and fire people. Yeah. And they were either going to do that with Bernie or they were going to do that with Trump, but they were definitely not going to do that with someone who was promising another 8 years of Obama.
So I wanted to, we've kind of mentioned Russia here and there. Mark, you wrote an article about how the $100,000 or whatever, or however much it was that Russia-related organizations actually spend on social media ads didn't actually matter. And you're actually in agreement with Brad about this.
Well, at a certain point, there's too much fake news about fake news. And so I wrote the article because any political professional would know that $100,000, 56% of which was spent after the election, so you're down to 44, most of which didn't actually go to targeted states, so you're down to 22, most of which didn't have the name of a candidate, so you're down to 11. You really, by the time you finish it, you're down to $6,500 in the election year in these states. So this was not an effort. Now, the two campaigns spent $2.4 billion. Hillary had a $400 million advantage. And if people think about the math of campaigns and the math of swing voters, essentially 70% of the money gets spent against swing voters in swing areas in the year of the election. That means that we're spending probably $1.5 billion. And so I think we have to put in context what politics has become, how many messages there really were, the week-long conventions, 3 90-minute televised debates. Don't kid yourself. Social media played a part, but really it was a part of extending to everybody, I think, this communication And the Russian part, well, I think it's a warning shot for next time. I do think that ads that are online should be identified just like ads that are on TV. There should be a verification process of some kind, just like TV, and then we probably have gotten a little bit too loose. But let's not say that these ads were the problem. These campaigns drove enormous messages, enormous numbers of time to people throughout this country. And if you tried to turn your TV set on in Ohio or Michigan in the last week, let me tell you, that's all you saw.
I think that one thing to say is, I've said this clearly, Trump used Twitter to talk to America. Facebook was not about ads to translate people into votes. Facebook was to pay the bills. It was where all the money was raised. So that's where all the prospecting was done. So people get confused between Facebook dark post ads and those changing people's minds and raising money from the base. If you look at the money, most of that money went to the Republican base to raise money, not target Democrats. Twitter was directly talking to the people and generating earned media. Those were the two engines, because you need the money to do all the things to generate all that, do it. But the people thinking that a huge amount of money went into what are called persuasive ads is just incorrect. It's just people don't understand exactly how politics work with raising money, prospecting, growing your list, GeoTV, and getting all these things done. It's a big process. But Facebook was not a place where we went out and changed the minds of America.
I think that had been happening, though, over all of those years. You know, you had the Koch brothers with the Tea Party. You had Citizens United. You had the overturning of the Voting Rights Act. You had gerrymandering. You had redistricting. You had governorships being taken over. You had unions being attacked, which mostly funnel money into the DNC. Like, this was a coordinated effort, I think, in understanding Obama's probably going to win, and he's probably going to get 2 terms. But we are going to be absolutely ready, take over the midterm elections, and we're going to be ready in 2000, in this past election, to really take over. And so it was, there was a sweet spot where the money could be raised specifically towards now those voters that have already been feeling that before hashtags were trending, people were already going against Obama, not my president. So there was such an opportunity there to just finally tap into them, to go, now is your turn to actually show up and vote. And really, no matter what was thrown at them from the DNC and all the negative ad campaigns, it just was not going to stick, because this was a base that was communicated to for years in a way that, and also in a way that was coming from all types of media platforms, from Sarah Palin constantly being a figure on SNL, and this was a conversation that was happening.
I think that's interesting because, as someone who was chief of staff at the RNC in 16 and at the RNC in 14, I can tell you, we got told all the time how terrible the Republican Party was at social media, and how as Republicans we didn't know how to talk to the electorate in a new way, right? We were all old white men, and we didn't know how to talk to the electorate. So the idea that we had a coordinated plan over 8
I'm
years
not saying
to
social
take
media.
Obama down.
No. But I'm not saying that you guys were using social media for that. I'm saying that there were real specific things that you were doing within these communities that was really feeding that. I was at the RNC when Sarah Palin was introduced. I was there when the DNC was making, when Obama and Seth Meyers were making fun of Trump right in the room that I was sitting in, going, this birther thing is ridiculous. Like, we saw for many years this conversation that was going on that kept questioning the legitimacy of his presidency, which I don't know would have been there had McCain won, when he was actually born in Panama. There was a really specific energy that was kind of targeted towards Obama that really lasted, so that when the social media campaign did start for this past election, it tapped into an energy that people wanted to show up for, but that had been built over many years.
I don't disagree with that. I just think the cause of that wasn't a targeted, arguably by the Republican National Committee or the Koch brothers or anti-union movement or anti-DNC. It was more that a huge amount, obviously a majority of the electorate voted for hope and change with Obama and didn't get any hope and change. They got higher health care premiums. They got the United States from a national or from an international platform becoming weaker. So they got all these things that they feel like Obama didn't promise them. And so you had 8 years of the electorate saying, hold on a second, we had this guy that promised hope and change. I don't feel so much hope and change. I feel my premiums are going up. I've lost my job. My kids are burdened with college loan debt they're never going to get out of. And so you had an electorate that was ready to listen to a new message, which was what President Trump delivered, which was, forget all this nonsense of these lifelong politicians that have been in the Senate, that have been community organizing for years. I know they're going to promise you hope and change. The reality is you voted for hope and change for 8 years. You got nothing changed. And you had President Trump come in who had never held elected office, that had a very different message, that really resonated with people, that had said for 8 years we were promised change and we got none of it. So we're willing
I
to
don't
take
think
a,
that's accurate to say that they got no change. I mean,
they got
obviously
higher
the
healthcare
passage
premiums,
of
they got more debt, they got a lot of change.
No, but I mean, with a lot of it came, he stopped the conversation with them, which is why he lost the House 2 years later. He definitely, going in drone strikes and so many of the other things that were going on that really distressed and disturbed a lot of voters. He did a really, he inherited from Bush a tremendous debt that he ended up being able to take down, but doing it what way? This was people going, why aren't we saying, let's give this money to the masses and see them spend that money and get their way out, as opposed to just bail out these other folks.
Which we would argue is a tax cut, which is what President Trump's trying to do right now. But yeah.
So I want to circle back to social media, and actually, what I want to get on is. It's very relevant to all of this. These new media companies that are now huge presences on social media. We're talking Breitbart or Canary, or even just personalities like Mike Cernovich, who now have hundreds of thousands of followers on social media, who can drive a conversation. And honestly, sometimes from the news media, we're finding that sometimes they can break news. Not all the times, but sometimes they can be correct. Nigel, I wanted to ask you, how do you, you've been in politics for a long time, how do you interact with these groups? Do you take them seriously when you see this, a person online who has 500,000 followers? Do you see them more important or differently than, say, the BBC?
Well, it's a dynamic environment, isn't it? You'll have half a dozen people who've got 500,000 followers, and maybe one of those goes through to have millions of followers. So, I've always taken the approach, engage politely with everybody and see what happens. Look, the BBC is still, in British terms, enormously important, and there's no getting around that. They're huge, state-funded, and they're a very powerful organisation. But you know something? Take, for example, ITV. ITV's evening news at 10 o'clock. 15 years ago, 12 million people a night watched that. Now it's less than 1 million. And that really is where the gap for social media, and in particular video. It's video that people want. It's video content they want, and that's why some of these people are becoming social media stars online. All I would say, and it's relevant being in Lisbon, is when you hear this conversation going on about American politics, and particularly, what Brad and Katie were talking about, how they were targeting from August onwards individual voters. Europe, Britain and Europe, we are literally years behind America in actually gripping this stuff and doing something with it. I find it remarkable. There's in UK politics, there's only 3 political figures who've got social media followings of more than 1 million. And if you go around the rest of Europe too, we are just way, way behind. And
why is that?
I honestly think that politics and political parties are stuck in a mindset of this is the way we fought the last election, it's the way we'll fight the next election. Most people in politics that I've met, they're obsessed with mainstream media. They're obsessed with their image on mainstream media. It's been easy for me because all of mainstream media has hated me, so I've had no difficulty in worrying about that. And they've just not got with it. And I think what we have seen is that social media can work for the left and for the right, but in British politics right now, it's the left that are doing social media well. It's Corbyn, it's Momentum that are doing social media well. He was able to get his super activists geographically to go to the parts of the country that mattered for the key swing seats. And I would say that if the British Conservative Party don't get with it on social media, Corbyn could win next time round on social media alone.
Do you think, though, like you were saying that earlier, you have these different folks like May, she's not getting enough, followers and stuff. You're really seeming to put it on the fact that their actual content has to be really amazing versus the fact that they're being chosen by folks to kind of push their content to be better. Because obviously Bernie his outreach wasn't so perfect, but it was them choosing him that had him step up that game, I think.
The message obviously, clearly the message matters. It's got to be exciting. It's got to be interesting. It's got to generate a bit of a buzz. But then the thing is, it almost doesn't matter how many followers you have. It matters how active they are. Are they really engaged? And the point about Momentum is that they've managed to get tens of thousands of people from their followership who are prepared with a text to get in a car, drive 100 miles and go and knock on doors. And that is where, because you asked this question earlier, does social media say we can kiss goodbye to traditional door knocking? No, absolutely not. Still, the most persuasive thing to make people vote is somebody respectable and decent knocking on your door, having a conversation. And it's the way social media merges with that and makes it more efficient that I think is the key.
People definitely need those reminders. You know, you find that you have to ask, you know, it's the same way for someone to run to office, you have to ask them multiple times. It's the same thing with voting. And you have to get them to vote at least, we learned that through Voto Latino, you got to get them to vote at least 3 times before they become a voter for life and make it their own thing to actually get up no matter how, if it's rainy that day or if they're stressed from work or they're sick, to still vote anyway. But I would definitely say on the social media thing, I think you're absolutely right that it is still also a lot about that content. I mean, one of the things that really I think helped Trump so much, and you know, when I grew up with him in New York, so I could see him coming a long time in the way. When you know, was it 17 other politicians that he went and eviscerated immediately and during the primaries, and people didn't see it coming, and it was like, but this is about being able to say, lock her up. This is about being able to just say, you know, other, stick with us, you're fired. Like this is the generation that pushes forward that content specifically around, you know, it being like slay and drag, and they, you know, it's interesting for them. It's making it clickbaitable. And you know, I think that's really, you know, it tapped into people's anger and upset. You know, it didn't have to articulate really incredible policies or have really strong conversations around stuff. It just had to connect with people's energy and emotion, and it became a very emotional vote this year, I think, more than anything.
Mark, in the 90s, compared to the 90s, compared to now, how has that messaging changed? Has it become more clickbait messaging because of social media?
Well, look, I think there are a lot of changes. There are a lot of changes since the 90s, obviously, but let me just give you one factor to bear in mind, I think both in the UK and the US first. This electorate has never been older. So the most fascinating thing in terms of social media is of course, Bernie Sanders organizing college youth has a huge advantage. Frankly, the Trump campaign had a disadvantage because it did very well with older voters, but there's also this strand of kind of younger men. But the UK, too, it is, in fact, the older generation that decided Brexit. It is the older generation that now was about as big as the younger generation. If you go back to John F. Kennedy, let me just go back not to the 60s, young people were 2-to-1 over 65. Now it's even, and it will continue going that way because of low population growth. So older people on social media will become more and more important. And to answer your question, I think the messages have gotten more negative, they've gotten more divisive, and it's a real problem in our politics that if everyone decides to tear everyone down, what is left to really be for? And I never used to worry about that, having written many negative ads myself, but at those days it was never 90 to 95% negative.
The Trump campaign has been criticized for being negative. Do you agree with that criticism? Some people said, especially on social media, he was sending out negative messages.
I think the president, I mean, Rosario makes this point. I think the president was echoing where the electorate was. I think the electorate was upset about where they saw the United States going over the last 8 years, where they saw their pocketbooks, where they saw their jobs. And I want to push back on Rosario a little bit. I mean, I think some of this negative messaging stuff, the lock her up, all this stuff is fun. You know, people would say people talk about it on, respectfully, CNN and MSNBC, whatever. I will tell you, having watched an electorate pretty closely for the last 8 years, people vote on their pocketbook, period. If the cost of milk is down, the cost of gas is down, and they have a job, they're going to vote for the incumbent. If it's not, they're going to put somebody else in office. And so we can talk about the 30-second ad that at the time candidate Trump ran that people thought was negative, but I'll tell you what, if they can afford gas, if they can afford milk, if their kid's in college and they can pay for it, they're going to vote for the incumbent. If not, they're going to change parties. And the problem they had right now is the economy wasn't where people wanted it. They were burdened with debt. Their health care premiums were going up, and they said, it can't get any worse, so let's take a chance on someone else that says they're going to do something different.
Well, that negative stuff is exactly what gave him the airtime, because he got so much free press from CNN and other places that would cover every negative tweet, that would cover a tweet that then or another conversation piece or another speech that would come out that had completely belied what had been said before, and that not needing the strategy of not necessarily needing to
you won't
stick
find anyone
to
that pushes back on the media as much as I will, and the president will. So don't we're on
right.
the same
No,
side on that.
I'm more criticizing the actual media for actually jumping on all of that negative stuff and taking advantage of it for their own ratings and making their own money during the election because they were hurting beforehand, and then not putting out that policy that people wanted to hear. And I would see literally Bernie Sanders doing a speech, and they would cut him off in his speech to show a pedestal, a podium going, Trump's about to start talking, because they knew he would say something incendiary, because as much as you can say, oh, people didn't, lock her up, it does tap into about the money, because he was talking about that she wasn't trustworthy, and so it did feed into that. But that charge and that energy that he brought to it and that negativity and those just really quick little hashtags, that kind of stuff was the stuff that people loved. That people loved kind of expressing their anger in that way.
He's an ultimate brander.
Yep.
For sure.
And he is a great business and marketing guy. And the United States elections have changed to understanding marketing, because it's like selling an iPod now.
And he understood
and if
that
you know how to do branding,
there is no such thing as bad press. It's called press.
Yes, yeah. At the second point, on a paid media, we spent about $220 million. I would say a very, very small fraction of that was spent in negative ads. Even if you look at paid TV ads, out of the $100 million we spent, I would say less than 15 million of that went to negative ads. There were some negative contrast ads in there, but actually a majority of our ads were actually to get that base to show up, which he was talking about, this group of people who are underperforming Republicans who we need to get off the couch to show up. It was about making them know they could show up and make change, real change. And I just think that to look at the negative ads and to say this was a battle over this group of people trying to change their minds is just incorrect. There was not really, from a paid standpoint, I actually think Trump campaign on a paid standpoint ran less negative ads than previous campaigns. I don't have the math to know that for sure, but we really didn't run that many.
So
they all read negative. Look,
well, I'm just
I think the
percentage of
standard
budget.
must have changed. The ad that says my opponent's a skunk is a negative ad, okay? And these guys ran negative ads on both sides, and I think that was the problem with politics. Now, in fairness, I'd say Trump had an issue agenda that he got out on trade, economics, etc., and Hillary should have gotten out more of an issue agenda. But these two battled to 65% negative each, so that right now America hates their president, they hate their past presidential candidate, they hate the Democrats, they hate the Republicans, they don't like the media, they question the judges. We have spun ourselves down as a country, that we have the best economics we've had in generations, and we have the most discontented people and the most hated politicians ever. And that's the disconnect.
I'm technically over time, but I'm going to keep everybody here for just a few more minutes, because these are all experts up here, and you guys probably have a lot you want to learn from them. So if all the panelists can go just really quickly, what's one message you want to send people? We have everybody from app developers here to politicians to media folks. What's been your most effective use of social media? What's a tip that you can give the audience? Rosario, we'll start with you.
No, let's go start over there.
Start with Katie? Okay.
I didn't know Rosario got to choose where we were starting.
Apparently.
I mean, I would say that, data matters, but message matters. And I go back to the messages you see that are resonating are because you're reading the electorate correctly and you're messaging to what the electorate is saying they care about. And so you need to be very sensitive with your ear to the ground about where the electorate is and send a targeted message to that electorate.
I would say think of broadcast media and social media as a 1-2 punch. Broadcast gives you content, gives you a message that reaches to everybody. Then you carve it up, serve it in pieces, and push it out, and the two work together best.
Brad?
I would say that people and products still excite people. Data shows the direction and the arrow, and it still comes to a creative human to understand how to deliver that.
Nigel?
If you can put out a serious message and at the same time make people smile or make them laugh, you will get 3 or 4 times the number of people look at that video than if you do it deadpan and serious. You can't always make people laugh, but the times you can, get a bit of humanity and a bit of humor into it, people just love it.
And I would just say that experience is everything, and actually putting that face time and talking to each other and asking questions and listening is tremendously important. What went down in town halls and going across the country and talking to people directly made this election the way it went not a surprise to me, because I actually did that FaceTime. I think that's tremendously important. We need to get off of our social media. We need to spend more time doing self-care so we don't vote impulsively. We don't just keep staying in this sort of knee-jerk reaction kind of space, but we start creating what it is that we actually want, so we don't just sit here continuing to have divided countries and divided conversations, but that we actually start growing towards someplace. Because I think our universal needs, this is a global society. When you see hashtags like Me Too taking over, it's a really big deal to see that we couldn't necessarily stop a sexual predator in office, go into major office, but you're able to actually then go, but let's connect on a larger group as a unit.
Clinton, yeah?
Yeah, there's a few of them, unfortunately, in our space, including in Parliament. But like it's one of those things where we're starting to really connect in our humanity and recognize our universal needs that goes beyond gender, that goes beyond red and blue, that goes beyond all these different things, and starts really talking to our values. And we need to start connecting and growing from there.
Well, this has been fantastic. I know that there's lots more questions, so hopefully you can find all of us later.
We will make America great again.